I'm Meadow Spencer. Let's go to the UN, shall we? And let's fix it. It's broken. We need some help there. The UN's been broken too long, actually, and we need to fix it. So I have three people here who have some ideas about whether the UN can be fixed, and if so, what's the best route to go to changing the defects in the UN. And I think chief among them, we all agree, is the problem of the permanent 5 members having a veto in the Security Council, and that veto carries over into almost every major international decision that might otherwise be adopted by the General Assembly and some of the other agencies of the UN. So everybody, lots and lots of people agree that we need an amendment conference to change the rules, the structure, the constitution, so to speak, of the United Nations. And let me introduce 3 people who are very familiar with the United Nations. My friend Doug Roche, a senator and representative of Canada at the United Nations for disarmament, the most eminent and frequently consulted expert about peace issues, international peace issues in Canada. So this is Douglas Roche. In Boston, I presume, is Winston Langley. Now, I've only recently become acquainted with Professor Langley, who's also retired. Both of us are retired professors. I'm pleased to say that I once taught at the university for which he later became the provost. He is a retired professor of international relations, I guess, or I don't know what your department was, Winston. What department were you originally affiliated with?
Political science and international relations, and I also associated with the School for Policy and Global Studies.
University of Massachusetts at Boston. I taught there once in 1968. Anyway, in Ottawa is Robin Collins, and Robin is a man of many parts. He is an activist and a scholar and a brilliant friend. And he knows, I consult him almost anything I need an answer for. If AI doesn't know the answer, I turn next to Robin, because he always knows what's so. And sometimes he knows some things that I think are not so. And I will then please ask Winston Langley if you will give us a picture of the game plan for this organization. I think it's becoming quite an important organization called the Coalition 109, or sorry, the Article 109 Coalition. So Winston is a member, and I think Doug is a member, along with a million other things that he belongs to. So, Professor Langley, give us the scoop.
Yes, the 109 coalition seeks to correct a major weakness in the United Nations Charter, something that began even before the United Nations was created at the Dumbarton Oaks Conference of 1944, where the discussions about the veto took place. And few people know that there were 2 sessions to that conference. The first session, neither China, for example, was not present. It was Britain, the US, and the Soviet Union. At the second session, China was invited, but then the most substantive discussion had already taken place. What emerged out of it was confirmed in Yalta in February of 1945, that the 5 permanent members would in fact have a veto in order to protect their interest, namely that the UN would never be able to act against them if they thought that the contemplated action might be contrary to the interest of this 5. In San Francisco, once the states got a hold of the proposed charter, they began to take exception to the idea of the veto. And that opposition was led by a number of countries, Australia, Canada, for a very brief period, Canada, Ecuador, Costa Rica, Iran. They all saw the weaknesses in the charter and, in fact, predicted some of the consequences that might result if the veto were allowed. The permanent 5, understanding the pressure that was emerging, and some of this pressure was led by non-governmental organizations, what we call today civil society, decided that perhaps they had better be prepared to make some concessions. And one of the concessions that was made is the adoption of Article 109, which said that in case the charter were to emerge in the way that many had predicted, perhaps something could occur beyond Article 108, which provides for normal amendment, namely the calling of a conference, a new conference. And if such conference were to be called, beyond 10 years, that is, if the charter were not amended in the fashion that was satisfactory to member states, then the conditions for calling a conference would change. Namely, it would require but a simple majority in the General Assembly, and any 7 members of the Security Council. It is this concession which is seen as a condition precedent to support of the existing charter that is now brought into conversation. The 10 years has passed. The conditions predicted have demonstrated themselves rather amply, and now there must be a comprehensive review of the charter. This is what the coalition is about.
Okay. Does everybody agree that that this is a normative obligation? That anybody can, I mean, I don't know who's supposed to be able to invoke this and call for a conference, but maybe you can give us the history of why it didn't happen. It was supposed to happen within 10 years, right?
Yes, yes.
And it didn't. Why didn't it? And how come it's only now being proposed?
Well, indeed, there was an effort earlier, that is within the 10-year period that was designated. But the permanent members, because of the Cold War, the permanent members claimed that it was inauspicious. The timing was inauspicious. And so as you know, we claim the Cold War has passed. There are a number of efforts made in the 1960s and disagreements about how it ought to be approached delayed the matter. For example, some of the permanent members began to say, why don't we decide ahead of time what the agenda for such a conference might be? Well, most of the other countries said, that's why we're having the conference in the first place. We want to talk about this. We don't want to make any decision about what we'll talk about ahead of time. That would be limiting what we would talk about. And so nothing was done. After the end of the Cold War, if we were to say 1989 or 1991, 92, whatever date we choose to use, a number of countries began to think about that possibility. The US, however, was quite opposed to it because I think the US wanted a chance to lead what we would call an essentially unipolar world, in which the United Nations would more or less ratify its positions. Now, however, we have not only governments involved, but a large number of civil society organizations, including some made up of very young people, who see this as a means by which a desired transformation of the UN may be properly effected.
So are they seeing it as involving potentially more than getting rid of the veto, but also changing other structural elements and maybe adding facilities to the United Nations, like an extra house or other such ways? I hear people talking about the importance of having the United Nations now competent to deal with AI and with climate change and such other global threats that we never thought about in those earlier days. Are people planning or hoping that such an amendment conference would be larger in scope about the kinds of changes that might be introduced?
Yes, of course. Many different changes are contemplated. The issue of the environment, for example, that you just mentioned, happens to be one of the major areas that is being thought about. The strengthening of the International Labour Organization, for example, its workers of the world would like to see a bit of that taking place. The role of civil society within the UN itself. And so the idea of a parliamentary council that people have spoken about happen to be part of what is being thought about. There are also issues having to do with the protection of the resources of the world at large. The forests of Brazil and the Congo are not to be regarded simply as the exclusive domain of national governments. If we're speaking of the lung of the earth, then the earth as a whole should have something to say about it. Just as one may say, we thought that it was important to have something to say about outer space and whether outer space ought to be used for the exclusive claims of individuals or companies or countries, etc.
I know that Doug is a member of the Article 109 Coalition, but maybe not as active in the planning. I know that I looked up their report for last year, and they've been very busy. And they have a plan. I think they have a home base in Geneva, and many very distinguished supporters, and a year by year plan for how they're going to try to bring this into existence. They're certainly very aware that you can't just call such a conference out of the blue. You have to prepare public opinion to pressure their own countries and so on.
So I have no objection to the proposal of the 109 coalition. I think 109 is in the charter for the purposes of consideration that the coalition is pressing for, which is potential amendments to the UN Charter. I guess my question is, where my skepticism is why this would succeed in, let's just take ending the veto. Let's just take that as an example of a case some people advocate for. I mean, the whole number of reasons why one might not want to end the veto, that is potential collapse of the UN as it is. But putting that aside, 109, Article 109 in the Charter, Section 2 of it makes it quite clear that any proposed changes require support by 2/3 of the General Assembly, including the permanent members of the Security Council. So there cannot be a veto in Article 109. I mean, a conference can be called, but any amendments within that conference could be vetoed by the veto-bearing states. So obviously, if the veto-bearing states don't want to end the veto, they would veto that proposed amendment. So, one can argue that the charter was flawed at its inception because it granted a veto to the P5. But we go back to 1945, it was very clear at the time that absent the veto, there would be no UN charter. So that was the trade-off. I mean, was it unfair? Well, maybe. Were there other options on the table? Not many. I mean, there were Australia was one of those states, as Winston was pointing out, that was advancing a charter without the veto. It was voted on a bit lopsidedly, maybe because of the number of abstentions in that vote, but the removal of the veto was voted down by those states that wanted to proceed with the charter. So maybe we can go later into what other mechanisms are possible. But I just want to make clear that I think the initiative is a good initiative because this is a forum at the UN that potential amendments can be discussed, and civil society can press their governments to be involved in that conference. But we shouldn't have any illusions that the conference will override a veto if the veto states don't want that to happen.
One may respond on three levels. First, there is precedent in amending the charter where the permanent five, or at least members of the permanent five, were opposed. The enlargement of the Economic and Social Council under Article 61, for example, it was amended twice. From 18 to 27, and then from 27 to 54 members, to accommodate the broadening membership of the UN and to change what was seen as the very narrow agenda that organ was following over the years. And although the permanent members opposed, when they saw how the world was going, they did change their stance and support it. So that's one. A second position is that if the principal weakness of the UN is deemed to be the veto, and a conference was called for reform that would include the veto, why would a conference decline to do the very thing for which the conference was called? Simply because members that benefit from the existing state of things would be allowed to continue. The third matter happens to be a simple principle of democracy, of an electoral process by which one becomes a member of the Security Council. For the permanent members, it is not electoral, it's inherited. It's an hereditary principle which is contrary to anything we believe in democracy. Why should that be continued? To the disadvantage of humankind. The UN, as we know it today, is a bystander to what is happening in the world. Iran, for example. Though there are other things that I could bring up Article 2, Section 2, that speaks of the obligation of members to fulfill in good faith. And the International Court of Justice has defined what good faith is meant. To fulfill in good faith the obligations of the Charter. Well, what does that mean in relationship to not dealing with the matters of human security? And that the veto, in fact, has prevented the UN from acting in some of the most horrendous violations of what we might understand to be the normative structure of the world. Genocide. I'll just throw that out.
I would like to thank Professor Langley for his initiative and his comments. And I'd like to commend you for having this webinar, opening up a subject that is of prime importance in our changing world. Permit me to say that among my books are two that I've written and devoted to the United Nations. So I have myself extensively examined this issue. And I do have a view on the question of veto and the Security Council and the effectiveness of the UN as a whole. So I will try to summarize my view in responding, and again thanking Professor Langley. I agree in part with what he has said, and I hope that the initiative that he is representing here today, the Article 109 Coalition, continues and gathers some steam on the way through. First, the veto is an anachronism. It's a terrible thing, and as has been said already, and as we understand, the UN would not have been able to come into existence in the first place had there not been agreement that the 5 states involved could have a veto. It the veto is itself in a process of change now. It viewed historically. We've at least got to the point now where when a state casts a veto, they're required to go before the General Assembly and explain the veto. They never did that before. So that is a step. And in taking that step, it indicates how reform of this matter is going to have to be done by degrees, not a sudden change and say, well, okay, let's have a vote to get rid of the veto or something like this. That a truncation of something that has become in several of the instances in which it has been exercised an abomination. The veto cannot be changed overnight. We have to live with it. So one possibility to augment the present system in which states have to report why they exercise the veto would be to subject that veto to a vote in the General Assembly. And with a two-thirds vote in the with a two-thirds vote in the General Assembly, leading to the overthrow of a veto with two-thirds, that is probably the most workable of the approaches that are now being taken to conditioning or modifying the veto. But meanwhile, we have to consider a larger question, and that is the timing of such change. Right now, we're engulfed in the most violent changes, and I use the word violent advisedly, that we have ever seen, certainly since the creation of the UN to begin with, in which nuclear armed in two occasions now, nuclear armed states have attacked states that do not have nuclear arms, and thus, by their action, establishing the case that you better have nuclear arms if you don't want to be attacked. It is a complete transformation of the original thinking of the UN that we are now living through in this discordant time of upheaval. I think that the timing of the reform of the UN has to be measured quite carefully in terms of the upheaval that we are going through today. That lest we do something or cause something to happen in the years of the Trump administration that can have a really deleterious effect on the thing. The thing is pretty bad now, but it could be worse. And thus, my thought is to try to get by the Trump years one way or another. And not that the international community will then be settled down, but at least it might be shorn of the poison that the Trump administration has injected into the international system. Meanwhile, I think that there could be some pressure re-exerted on the expansion of the Security Council. It's well known that the Club of Four, India, Japan, Germany, and Brazil, have been operating for years, trying to break through the barriers. So those states, which I name again, India, Japan, Germany, and Brazil, should be members of the permanent members of the Security Council to reflect the modern world. The modern world is not reflected in the composition of the Security Council today, which was reflected the world of 1945. So I think that there is growing less resistance. There is less resistance now than perhaps years ago to expansion of the Security Council by those four, and including on top of those four that have already joined together into a club, a state or two from Africa. It is unthinkable, in my view, that 1/4 of humanity that's going to be represented in the Africa of 2050 is not represented in the Security Council. So Africa has to work out which one of either Nigeria or South Africa or both joining the Security Council. So I leave it at that the expansion of the Security Council is something that should be kept alive, and it shows some forward movement. The other side of the thing is the elected members each year, the non-permanent members, of which there are 10 in tranches of two. I think this should be increased to 15. And that is also probably more doable than some other suggested remedies, so that there will be more opportunities for more states to join the Security Council, even if not on a permanent basis. So what I'm looking for here is something that's workable. I take a highly pragmatic approach to a principled organ, the United Nations, is full of the principles, the charter of how we should live, and go on with principles, but make them work, and respond to today's the outrageous attacks on international law and the precedents that have been set for how to build the world coming out of post World War II, to react to that. So that is my view. To summarize, I think that the Article 109 club should continue, but even the calling of a conference, even if the conference might get by, that it was not it. The calling of the conference was itself not being subject to a veto, but within such a conference, the subject of a veto being changed would be vetoed, and so the fight would always be on canceling the veto. Canceling the veto, if it couldn't be done in 1945, I don't see how it's going to be done today when the conditions of intercourse in the world are so much worse. Therefore, a modified approach to amending, to modifying the work of the UN in the world in which we live in the manner that which I have outlined above, I think is more workable today.
So I agree pretty well entirely with what Doug just stated. I'd be interested to see how much Langston agrees or disagrees with what Doug stated. But I wanted to raise a few points, in part to the 3 point elements that you mentioned, Langston, on why reform is possible, and you raised the examples of expansion of the Economic Council and so on. Now, my feeling is, and I don't know the details on that particular expansion, or two of them, I guess you said there were. My feeling is that this was not highly provocative to the P5, and therefore they let it happen. I don't know whether there had to be ultimately vote by the P5 on making that change to the charter. I assume it did, even though they were opposed, they went along with it. I think it's how you phrased it, ultimately, because of pressure and so on. And I think that is the proper process for amendment if it does take place. I don't know that the veto is the principal weakness of the UN. In one sense, I mean, and I agree with you that it's an undemocratic element of the charter. It's built into the charter. It is the essential element of the charter. In fact, those who have written about the creation of the UN Charter, they've made it very clear that this was the issue, the central issue around which the Charter's success or failure ultimately would hinge. And the whole process that took place is fascinating. I don't know if you probably read Schlesinger's book on that. But the act of creation, that's a really interesting book on. I mean, it's also using material that came before, but it comes to me, it comes out very clear that the negotiations that went on, not only between the U.S. and then the Soviet Union and their, Gromyko and Stalin and others, with Truman primarily and his associates. It was tense. It was touch and go. They thought it would fail. There's the famous Connolly holding up the UN the draft UN charter in front of delegates who were critical of the veto and saying you've got two choices. You get the veto, but you lose the charter. And then he ripped up the draft charter, and then they had the vote, and the charter as is came about. So, and I'm not disputing the point that and I don't like the stench of the concept of a veto. I've opposed the veto in the past. So the question is timing, as Doug says, whether this is the time. Even to raise it in a conference might be considered provocative. I don't think that's necessarily, a dead end for bringing it up. But other options are, and I raise this one in particular because it does reside in the charter to a certain extent, and that's on the abstentions of states that are party to a conflict. So the veto on security, peace and security issues is raised um, uh, as a problem because if a major state power, like the P5 in particular, are engaged in a conflict, then they can veto a critique of that engagement or a resolution at the Security Council to block or impede what they're doing. And uh, I mean that's to a certain extent that's the nature of the beast. And but there are two cases where those members of the Security Council are required to abstain if they're party to those conflicts, and that's it's not Chapter 7. It's not implementing action on peace and security. It's Chapter 6 and Chapter 8. Right? 8 is regional meeting conferences being called. Chapter 6 is peaceful resolution of conflict. And if a P5 member is party to the conflict, then they are required by the UN Charter to abstain in the vote. So they cannot veto process going forward. So what people want, of course, is that to be applied to Chapter 7 as well, when there's actually a conflict in action, not a peaceful resolution, but actually a violent situation. And so I would say because there's recognition of the importance of abstention already in the charter, that might be one of the options that could be put forward. That if a UN Security Council Permanent 5 member was involved in a conflict, they would have to abstain if there was a resolution coming forward. Second best is what happened in 2022, the item that Doug mentioned, the veto initiative, where if there is a veto, it goes immediately, I think within 10 days or something, to the General Assembly for discussion. But that doesn't override the Security Council, but it does raise the visibility of what happened.
And I want to thank my two colleagues, Ambassador Roche. You should know I was born in Jamaica, and you are a sort of beacon of light in my own thinking in the matters of disarmament, as I got a sense of the international system, as it were. And Robin, thank you for your comments. A recent book of mine, Abolishing War, in fact, goes into some of the areas. I took the position that the permanent members are unlikely to forego the privilege conferred by the veto, and therefore a series of reforms I proposed were designed to circumvent the long-term impact of the veto. It included expansion of the council, but not an expansion with permanent members. They would have 6-year renewable memberships. because I think it's not good to think in terms of one country inheriting a position regardless of its demonstrated commitments to the ends of the Charter. That is, behavior should be rewarded, and it's rewarded by after a 6-year term, renewable another 6, etc. We would continue the 2-year term for existing non-permanent members and expand that group as you are proposing. And I would find the possible overriding by the General Assembly very much a commendable course of action, because I think it would grow in impact over the years morally, and would have a limiting effect on those subject areas, as Robin has just indicated, that permanent members would elect to veto. I also agree on timing, that one must be patient here and wait until some of the existing poison in the system or somehow dealt with. But I wonder what you would think of strengthening the Uniting for Peace resolution, which was adopted during the Korean War, that allows the General Assembly to act in circumstances in which the use of the veto in the Security Council prevents the Council from acting. I'd like your comments on that. My book dealt with that as one way of dealing with the current problems, as it were. In respect of the fact that without the veto, we would not have a UN, I think that's true. And that is particularly true for the former Soviet Union. Because for Stalin, and that is very clear at Yalta, he thought that the Soviet Union was facing a rather formidable West, and that could turn the UN against the Soviet Union, and especially because it was espousing communism, which is antithetical to everything the West economically represented. He saw that as a potential mortal threat. So without that veto, he was not about to support it at all. Roosevelt recognized that very quickly and sought to find ways of dealing with the Soviet Union. In fact, but for the US, we would not have had the distinction between substantive issues and procedural ones. That was one way of getting the former Soviet Union to make a concession here. Stalin wanted everything to be subject to the veto. So I very much agree with you. But do you know something else? That without it, we would not have had a UN. It's a matter of human rights. The non-governmental community in San Francisco, the civil society community, the lawyers, the teachers, the women's groups, the workers, etc., they said, we are not going to support what you're proposing without a greater emphasis on human rights. And all I would ask is one to look at the draft charter that was brought from Dumbarton Oaks to San Francisco, and the charter we had coming out of San Francisco, and its focus on human rights. The right to life is something that we find as a very important normative area within international relations and international law. I think getting rid of war, the elimination of war, is an obligation that was assumed that I think we ought to think of in relationship to the veto.
Professor, thank you again. your vision and the passion that you reflect, your very commendable views on the UN I'd like to emulate that myself. I summarize my views on all of this uh, by saying that the situation today is unparalleled in the history of the United Nations. The threat to the existence of the United Nations itself has never been so fierce. Um, I don't believe that in this conversation I have to dwell on this. I think we all understand the torrent of abuse that the UN is undergoing now, and its funding problems, and particularly the attacks on it by the United States. In the long run, I state tangentially, we may look to China for increasing leadership on the future of the UN. It is China today that is best responding to the UN crisis. But I would summarize my views by saying this: we have to keep the United Nations from being destroyed, from being completely overridden. That is object and goal number one today, and I say that with great sadness because the United Nations' potential for lifting up humanity and in many dimensions and the pillars of how we live, economic and social development, arms control and disarmament, environmental protection, and the advancement of human rights. Those key platforms of the United Nations were such a blessing and a boon to humanity that we have to, and they still are, can be, and are to a large to some extent today. But they're being rolled over by the NATO expansion has had a lot to do with the undermining of the effect of the United Nations and the continuation of you said the elimination of war as a goal. Of course, the elimination of war, but just to getting to a position where we can have an intelligent argument on the abolition of war. I see that Pope Leo has come out and he's actually used the words now. There's no such thing as a just war. So the just war theory that was used as a basis for to give some moral support for war is itself in the process of erosion. So we have to give it a little bit more time. So too is the movement from a culture of war to a culture of peace. On December the 16th, 2016, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Declaration on the Right to Peace, the right to peace, as a given right. Now, most of the Western states voted against that resolution, but it did pass by a vote of 141 in favor and about 35, I guess, opposed, and about 30 or 40 abstentions. So, it's a long way from a workable resolution. But the movement of the shift of the world coming out of the Cold War and as the early 1990s began, and the Security Council met for the first time at the summit level in 1992 and commissioned the Secretary General of the day, Boutros Ghali, to write an agenda for peace, was itself a milestone. Mr. Boutros Ghali did write the agenda, and his successors a few times down the line, Antonio Guterres has updated, and he's written a new agenda for peace. And the very first item on that agenda for peace is the abolition of nuclear weapons, and along with steps then for preventive diplomacy and so on to head off wars. So there are so many workable things. There are so many things that don't seem to be working today, but are there, and that what my plea is that we not let the current crisis defined not only by Trump, because there's this period of history that we're passing through as we try to transition from the old culture of war to a new culture of peace. We have to give it time to work through, and in the time it takes to move humanity to a higher level, even if only marginally so, a higher level of how we treat one another in human rights, should not be jeopardized by too abrupt an action that could lead to a fracture, a more fractured UN that we have now. So, with respect to a pragmatic movement forward, the parliamentarians are certainly working on this, and the International Parliamentary Union, it's got itself well placed now to be in a position to lead the campaign for a parliamentary assembly in the United Nations. This has been talked about for a long time, and of course, civil society wants to have a stronger voice also, and the distinctions between civil society as such and the defined parliamentarians who would be elected, that is something that has to be noted. And so I do think that the influence of civil society, which is resisted some of the major powers on the Security Council, in my view, in the years that I spent at the United Nations, I saw them resisting civil society at every turn, but ready perhaps to accept the inevitability that parliamentarians, people who are themselves elected, whether those parliamentarians would be delegated from their countries or there would be an international election, that still has to be worked out. But at least we're moving in a direction when the United Nations, the decisions and the movement of the United Nations would be based on more than just governments per se, but people who make up those governments, and in other words, the people of the world, people of our common society, of our common home. Now that is an elevation of human conduct and interaction that awaits considerable maturity. And so I close by saying that we have to be careful today in what we do, that we not cause a situation where what might be, to use a word that my own prime minister has now made famous, rupture, that there would be a further rupture in the world, and a rupture in the United Nations. We have the United Nations Charter, and through thick and thin, through the fires and storms and turmoil of today, I always tell my audience, when I'm still speaking to them, I say, hang on to the Charter of the United Nations. That's our anchor, and if we stay with it, we can build on it and modify it as we move along.
Of course, we must not destroy the good things that we still have in order to get something better. But at the same time, I see that the Article 109 coalition is working with the idea of changing public opinion and moving people in the direction of demanding that their governments act toward amending the UN Charter and incorporating such things as you've mentioned, the Parliamentary Assembly idea, which is really my hobby horse. I believe that is very important, and it should be part of the whole amendment process, which would include changing a number of structures and not just overcoming the veto. The general public opinion now is, it's true that the dictators might actually get elected again and get support. But there are enough of us who feel desperate, looking for alternative solutions and not seeing the leadership that should be there of organizations or individuals who put together a vision of the future which actually has some substantive plan, what kinds of structural changes we need that would make a difference. We need to have a strong vision of what has to happen to get us out of this horrible mess, which everybody recognizes now. Everybody sees that we're in despair and in deep trouble. Doug, can you see the utility of the Article 109 coalition as having some value in creating pressure and demand on states to take stronger action and to create a more clear vision of what it is that needs to be done?
Yes, of course I do. I think that it's a positive and constructive manner of bringing together people who know something about the UN and who care, and even more importantly, care about its future. And I just hope that it will move in such a way that it can, in responding to the crisis of the day, that it does so in ways that do not undermine that which we already have, and that allow us to build forward.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah.
Winston.
Yes, and I very much agree with Ambassador Roche and with your summary. I think in my book I did make mention, in fact, I refuse to define war in the conventional sense. I spoke of the culture of war, how it is defined in our societies, and how we unconsciously behave in ways that might surprise us if we were to analyze them more carefully. It proposes a non-violent movement in the world to help to change opinion, in which people learn from one another, just don't depend on what is being reported about one another, and to discover within ourselves a closer kinship with one another. And I propose an international human rights court where the decisions would directly have a bearing on people so that they become increasingly understanding of global and international institutions. And then the book goes into a discovery of the cosmopolitanism in each of us, something which has been almost erased from us by the influence of nationalism and the culture of war. So I'm very much in considerable agreement with Ambassador
Okay.
and with my friend Robin, although he may think to the contrary.
Well, let's see if he still does. Robin?
To the contrary, I'm not to the contrary. So let me give a positive spin, a hopeful outlook too. And I would start with the veto initiative from 2022, where vetoed resolutions go to the General Assembly. I think that's a sign. That was a unanimously supported resolution that includes all members of the P5, right? That supported that resolution. That's a positive step, in the midst of war that took place as well. It's a recognition that reform is potentially useful. It was a resolution at the UN General Assembly. I believe it was after or related to the invasion of Ukraine, because critique of the Russian invasion of Ukraine prevented a resolution at the Security Council. The General Assembly raised this, the subject of any veto at the Security Council, the resolution should then go within 10 days, I believe it is, to the General Assembly to discuss. And that was supported, I believe, unanimously, including by the Russian delegate in the General Assembly. That they at least did not vote against it. So this was an indication of a process by which, it's a process towards that 2/3 of the UN General Assembly overriding the Security Council. It's not quite that, because it's only about discussion of the issue. But maybe the next step would be, the UN General Assembly overriding the Security Council one day. But let me just put this into context. The UN is as it is, and the charter is written as it is because this is the a reflection or a symptom of the way nation states are in the world and the way governments are in the world. And if we're to expect that to change, in other words, for the charter to become a fully democratic document, then we need to expect those nation states to do the same thing, and especially the powerful states. So we need to build, that common security approach that is embedded within the United Nations Charter. That's, where you listen to your enemies as well as your allies to resolve conflicts and so on. And I mean, Winston mentioned Uniting for Peace. This was another example of an initiative of when the Security Council blocked an action on a conflict situation, it would go to the General Assembly for discussion. Now it's for discussion, and the General Assembly would make a recommendation to the United Nations Security Council. It did not override the Security Council. So again, it's the same phenomenon. But when we fish or cut bait, when times are tough, we build the process in the background, and this is, I think, what Winston's organization is doing to develop the mechanisms for change when we can implement them.
I think your debate here is about whether you can keep the UN Charter in the form that it is and somehow make enough change in the world or in public opinion or in the relations among states or some other way of getting around it so that decent governance, global governance, can be achieved within the current structure of the United Nations without having to amend it, without having to amend the charter. And I don't want to open that up for a whole other conversation, but I think that's the bottom line.
The charter as it is right now would be sufficient if all member states were democratic and acted according to the principles of the UN Charter, right? So you wouldn't have to remove the veto if the P5 acted democratically and appropriately according to the ambitions of the Charter.
Could you do things like, sorry, but could you do things like Doug is talking about a parliamentary assembly, which I think is a very important thing. Could you add a parliamentary assembly with the full powers that it would need to have, given and do that within the current charter? Could you do that?
I don't see why not,
Yeah,
but
there's political will, and in order to get to these, where you're going in these questions, Meta, the first preeminent issue is to get the poison out of the air at the present time in order for us to make some progress. Now, you can define poison by saying Trump, but I would say it's Trump plus to get the poison out.
Yeah, well, that's what we have to discuss further, I guess. Maybe that should be our next conversation, is what's the matter with democracy that it is so poisoned now globally that people support something like, the U.S. actions. And okay, we have to come back another day. Winston, I'm going to give you the last word.
No, I agree to come back on that very important subject area of discussion, and I really enjoyed our exchange. I agree very much that the UN is pretty much indispensable for the world in which we find ourselves. And speaking of reforming does not in any wise bespeak any questioning of its role in the world, its importance, its indispensability, and we must preserve it in every sense that we understand it, almost any cost.
Thank you all very, very much. This is, I can't think of another more important topic that we need to address. So this is not the last conversation of this kind on this topic. Thank you all. And I invite people who watch this to post your own comments on our Substack reply button. You can react to this, or on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. You can put your own thoughts about this, and some people will read each other. Okay, bye, friends.
Thank you.
Thank you.